Hello and welcome to Stream of Consciousness episode 2. Today we are talking about thinking about non-verbal leakage, unintentional leakage, things like body language, and basically all the stuff that we say without meaning to, or the stuff that gets picked up without intentionally communicating it. So say for example you've got the microphones and cameras and all your devices, they pick up lots of things that you might not intend to communicate. The thing is that works across many different levels. So for example, let's say you're hanging out with a friend, your body language might communicate something that doesn't quite match what your vocal communication has. And it can lead to miscommunication if it's not addressed quickly. At the same time, it's where we understand things like subtext. And as listeners of this podcast will eventually learn, I'm a very big fan of understanding the various levels to which everything works. And something that's coming to mind at the moment is the idea of what subtext means relative to digital interfacing, as in what a can a computer can a computer pick up subtext? Is the technology we have sophisticated enough that no matter how well we try to disguise our true feelings, as it were, that's always going to be given through? Because something I've noticed personally is that once you've got a high enough degree of what I think it gets called emotional intelligence, it becomes easier and easier to understand how people. Oh, excuse me very much. It becomes easier and easier to understand how people might communicate subliminal messages in their own words. So, say for example, you're talking with somebody that has a secret and they don't want to share that secret. It might be quite personal, it might be slightly embarrassing, it might cause a lot of distress if people were to find out. So they, for reasons best known by themselves, they wish to keep that secret. The tricky part of that then becomes is if that secret's intentionally being kept secret, what happens when someone with sufficient emotional intelligence or a device that can read emotional intelligence picks up on the signals that are being transmitted by the secretive body, as it were, the secretive signal emitter? Does that effectively mean that everything within that person, does that mean effectively there's no such thing as secrets? Does that mean if there's no such thing as secrets, that everything we've ever wanted to hide has a tell to it, as it were? So, for example, let's say I didn't want to tell you something, and I want to keep that secret until the day I die. Does that mean no matter how hard I work to not verbally communicate that, as well as control my body language, will I eventually, intentionally or otherwise, sorry, I'm just not saying it that, does that mean eventually, unintentionally or otherwise, you will figure out what the secret is, and despite the lack of confirmation, you'll have your own speculation? Because then that means the communication between people will not only carry the subtext, that's been intentionally communicated, there will also be subtext that's, for example, the interpretation of subtext is going to be different from person to person, from human to human, as it is from device to device. So, for example, the laptop versus the phone versus the tablet, as well as all the various software that's picking things up. So, say, for example, Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, Meta, Microsoft, Android, pick your poison, as it were. If all of them are able to detect audio input to some degree, as well as the video input, they'll all interpret them in their own way it's just part of their algorithmic process. Which means to some extent, no matter how hard we try to conceal something, you can almost behave about it in a way that, like, if you, like, a higher power knows, whether that's God or like a computer or alternate life or just a smarter human being might be able to understand you better than you understand yourself, in the same way that parents tend to understand their kids better than the kids like to admit. And then it becomes a question of, well, if everything we wish to keep to ourselves is already known by higher powers, then to some extent we have to differentiate between higher and lower. And then that becomes a hierarchy. So there's a hierarchy of higher and lower understanding. Then the higher your personal understanding becomes, the deeper, broader, more versatile you're able to interpret information, like what's it, acquisition, storage, and retrieval. The deeper you're able to understand information and then re-communicate it to other people. What was that then? The deeper you can do that, then the deeper you're going to be able to understand what subtext really means. So if subtext comes out and becomes a thing that you want to keep to yourself, as it were, then to some degree you can control the narrative, can't you? Because if you know that you're communicating subtext in a sense that it's almost like doublespeak, if you know how to doublespeak, then in some sense there's a message you're liminally communicating, there's a message you're subliminally communicating, and then there's your internal monologue which knows between them. And I wonder if such things as triple and quadruple speak would exist in some scenario. But then it becomes all quite Orwellian. So we then have to wonder, how well does technology interpret all of our communications? Because if technology can interpret all of our communications to such a degree that there are no secrets from the AI, there's no secrets to our technological overlords, then basically we kind of have to behave like actors. And I'd much prefer to just be myself all the time, but to sort of run the thought process, the thought experiment, as it were, of what acting entails. Pardon me, I've been working quite hard recently and not had as much sleep as I'd like, so we'll be working on that. Does that mean to some degree that we're all actors and all the world is stage, as per Shakespeare, and that the way we respond to the stimuli of the world is just us responding to a script? Is it really all that different from us just performing the roles that we choose to? Because I guess to some extent, it's just something I've always felt, is that anytime I write something down, it's like I'm writing a script for myself. And it's been like that ever since I was a kid. I always felt like when I was writing something, it wasn't just me. Like if I was writing a novel, it wasn't just me creating characters and a world and a plot line. It was, there's tangible consequence to it all. It was almost as if it was just versions of me being expressed via creativity. And the better I've come to understand myself, the better I've learned to communicate in various forms, including written works. And there's a saying I've heard before where all writing is autobiographical, which makes sense to me. It just does. It's every time I read back my work, no matter how detached from my personal feelings I'm intending it to write, even if it's uber scientific and as clinical as possible and there's no personal addresses in it whatsoever, there's still levels of what's going on in my personal life being communicated in it. I can just tell. So in the same way, we have to wonder if everything everybody writes has that same level to it. For example, even excuse me, no, well, I guess that comes into like literature analysis. So, for example, if you've got a series of novels that are, each book's hundreds of pages long, it's all just reflections of the inner workings of the author, but then it's not purely their timelessness being communicated as much as it is their situational context. So say, for example, they've got a situation that's been going on for a couple of weeks, and they're in the midst of the heat of it whilst they're writing something, that's going to come through in their works. But then when they edit it later with a different state of mind, it can entirely change what they want that scene to be, or even if out of, let's say, 1,000 words, they edit 10, those 10 words can completely alter the dynamic, maybe because they perceived it as the influence that had caused that word choice in the first place, and they want to sort of mitigate it a little bit to be more impartial. Because in the same sense, when I'm saying that, I can hear myself communicating about subliminal messaging and non-verbal communication at the same time. Because if I'm thinking about editing myself in a vocal context, for example, this communication right now, what I'm saying, at some point I'm going to be talking about these same subjects to other people. I will be following the loose scripted guidelines of this because it's a thought I enjoy talking about, and it's something I do a bit of work with, it's something I talk to at universities and stuff. So it makes sense that everything I'm communicating is a script that I'm writing in real time. So then editing in real time then becomes the alterations I do at the next recital. So say, for example, I communicate with somebody about this exact thing, whether it's in written form, vocal form, or whatever else, then yeah, I will not only have their input to work off of and vary my answers a bit with, but I'll also have thoughts that I've come up with now that I communicate to them that are slightly different. And it's just trying to understand how the ethics of that works, because to some extent, if I'm only ever doing what I feel is in my best interest, then that is, in my understanding, kind of the whole point of doing the communication. Is like I'm communicating something I want to communicate because I feel it's the right thing to do. The fact that it's in my best interest, that's kind of the point from a purely sort of survival of the fittest perspective of the whole point of life is to perpetuate life. It's kind of why we humans do anything, really, is to just reproduce. And the weird thing is, you can see that whole concept being reflected at various levels of society, whether it's reproduction as a parent or reproduction in reliving glory days, or reproduction in creative outlets, or reproduction in doing the same thing over and over to try and get a better result, just with slight editations here and there. It's, to some extent, an algorithm is going to understand all of that, because an algorithm is reading you all the time. The algorithm never gets tired. The algorithm never gets hungry. The algorithm will always be there. It doesn't matter what company designed it. It doesn't matter what device it's working through. It's always going to be there in some way, shape or form. So the sooner we learn to understand how algorithms work, the better. The tricky thing is understanding which algorithm's doing what, because I can say to you right now that I think algorithm A is influencing me to try podcasting, but it could entirely be algorithm B, in the same way that algorithm C might be working in harmony with algorithms A and B to get me to do a podcast. So then I have to wonder, as much as I'm enjoying podcasting, is it entirely an organically occurring thought, or to some extent is it the result of pre-programming and priming? Because if I've been pre-programmed by an algorithm because it knows I'll enjoy podcasting, is it doing that from a purely altruistic perspective because I'll get stuff out of it and I'll enjoy doing it? Or, as most algorithms are designed, is it doing it for the sake of finding something that is for its own benefit, or its creator's own benefit? Because it could entirely be, and I don't want to fluff up my chest too much when I say this, it could entirely be that this podcast, brings me fame and fortune, as it were. It's not the reason I'm doing it, but I'd be lying if I said I hadn't thought about it. And then it makes me wonder, well, how much of my non-verbal communication has transmitted signals to devices that's given it the interpretation that what I really want is to be rich and famous? And if that has been communicated to the algorithms, how has it been communicated without me directly saying it? I know at some level there'll be stuff that the way I speak, for example, enjoying positive public attention, I think most people can agree that's quite nice. And I don't think I really have to explain the benefits of being rich. It just makes most life easier. It doesn't solve everything, but it solves most things, and it alleviates a lot of stress. So why wouldn't you want to be rich? Anyway. But then if I'm being pushed towards doing podcasting, is it purely because an algorithm understands my non-verbal communication in such a way that I'll enjoy podcasting, so I should just do it, which is what my personal interpretation of it is? Or is at some level does it see that I have the ability to be a podcaster because I quite like talking and I'm reasonably articulate? Or is it entirely possible that these podcasts, and let's say I do 100 of them total before it picks up any steam, or 1,000 of them before I get to where I feel like I've accomplished what I want to accomplish with it, will it be that once I've done that 100th podcast, that some other opportunity arises, which is what I really wanted all along? And if I'm, broadcasting these at the rate of let's say at least one a week, then that's 2 years. Does that mean the algorithm's calculated 2 years ahead of time a plan for me that's actually exactly what I want and will make me happiest and most successful? And if it can do that, then that means that's 2 years worth of planning, which it makes it fair to understand that there's been 2 years of planning prior to that, right? Which means that's a total of 4 years worth of planning, which means that our lives aren't as in control of as we thought they were. But then we have to wonder how much of our input, how much of what we provide as input to the algorithms determines the outcome, as much as how much of the input we provide to algorithms is a result of algorithmic behavior that's a result of previous input. And the further we understand algorithmic behavior, as well as our communication with algorithms, not only do we gain prescience, that foresight becomes more and more accurately perceptive. Like we'd be able to see across a broader set of timelines, as it were, and deeper into the more personally relative ones. For example, if you're at work, you might be able to understand likely consequences of certain behaviours with certain colleagues, in the same way that if you're at school, you're able to sort of better predict likely outcomes depending on what grades you get. In the same way that if you're at the gym, it's a lot easier to predict what your physical output is going to be if you control various inputs to it. For example, your diet, your routine, your sleep. If you have those three factors consolidated and you understand how well you respond to each component, then it's not hard to predict a rough trajectory of where you're going to get with it. And if we can do that on a simple basis, something much smarter than us can do that on a much more complex basis. So then we have to understand what does our... Sorry, this game review's taking bloody ages. How does our non-verbal communication, how does our non-verbal leakage, how is that interpreted? Because then there's obviously going to be cultural differences between various hand positions. Because I know in some parts of the world a thumbs up is quite rude, as opposed to where I am now, where it's relatively polite. in the same way that, you know, a middle finger can be misconstrued in different places, or a pinky finger, or a ring finger, an index finger. It's all relative to context. So then we also have to consider the cultural biases put into the algorithms that were designed primarily by American companies. And then at the same time, we've got to consider, for example, if you live in China, where they've got a lot, because of their current political state, some Western algorithms don't have much, as far as I'm aware, direct influence, but then they'll have their own local alternatives. So does that mean somebody who lives in China for 30 years and then comes to the West is going to, it's not just the cultural difference because of how people behave, there'll be an algorithmic culture difference. Algorithmic culture, as it were, in the same way that somebody's lived in, let's say, New York or Los Angeles or Denver or Austin for 30 years, then goes to Shanghai or Beijing. And then you've got places in the middle, for example, all the various cultures across Europe as well as parts of Asia, and I mean the different states of America have all their own different cultures as well. So to some degree, all that local body language culture will be interpreted by algorithms, but then to some extent it will become a global body language culture. Because if you think about it in a long enough timeline, if the whole idea of globalization continues the way that it seems the intention is from globalists, then we'll all become one homogenized, I'm not sure if homogenized is the right word, one big collective which understands linguistical interpretations, interprets communicative interpretations. That will become one globalized community which interprets all communication through a broadly similar perspective, rather than having mistranslations because of language barriers, which you can argue is for the greater good. And then at the same time, does it also remove part of what makes us us? And it's, at some point, it makes me wonder that the more aware people are of algorithms, how aware of an algorithm do you have to be to respond to the algorithm? That if there's various levels of algorithmic awareness, then people at various levels of algorithmic awareness will be given various levels of algorithmic priority. So say, for example, me doing this podcast, communicating about these sort of things is something that either the algorithm itself is deemed to be valuable or the algorithmic creators have determined to be valuable. I mean, for all we know, I'm on some sort of watch list and somebody's paid attention to what I'm saying. It's like, no, actually, we want that getting to the public, or we don't want that getting to the public, either way around you look at it, that it results in my prioritization from the algorithm to be given, I don't know, more exposure, so then my videos get more views, which means my page gets more subscribers, which then ultimately contributes to my success. Because if I can understand how that works, then obviously I'm going to do that to my advantage, aren't I? But it's in the same way that anybody who's trying to be successful is going to understand the various unspoken rules, unwritten rules, that sort of thing. Like, if I'm trying to think of it, like, for example, there was a whole thing in Hollywood for years about if you had, so we just say, sexual relations with people of a certain, what's the word, position within Hollywood, it was quite easy for you to get roles. The whole Harvey Weinstein thing. Then that means to some extent that's just playing the game, isn't it? If you know that you're going to be given priority for doing this, that, or the other, well then, is there much reason why you shouldn't do this, that, or the other if your moral compass isn't that fussed about being Yeah, then it sort of becomes a question of personal ethics, doesn't it? Let's say, for example, you are quite happy to, have sex with somebody to be given professional success. Then, one, the people who are providing the professional success, as it were, are going to be quite happy to keep that system going because, well, they wouldn't offer those services if they didn't want something out of it. In the same way that if you know that's how you progress through the system, you're going to continue progressing through the system. But of course, there are people who don't like the system functioning that way because, depending on your personal morals, that's, it's a bad system. And I get it. I'm not trying to argue for or against the trading of of sexuality and sexualness and trading sex for a position. I'm not trying to argue for or against it. It's not what I'm trying to be as completely neutral and like unbiased about this as possible. Yeah, let's say it's a trading of a non-skill based commodity. And I'm not trying to say that you're bad at sex. I'm saying that if your only point of value is a commodity which is out with the skill set required of your industry, then technically you don't need to be good at your job to go far in your industry. Which means if you don't have to be good at your job, you just have to know what the commodity those in power value most, then why should you bother being good at your job when you can develop the commodity which has proven to provide useful rewards. So in this context, if that turns out to be sexual favors, if let's say, if we continue the Hollywood context, if you get really good at acting, or you get really good at writing, or producing, or sound tech, lighting tech, then if you're really good at those skills, and obviously that helps, but if you're really good in bed and use that to your advantage and sleep your way to the top, you'll probably be, there's a certain degree of skill required anyway. That's like, it's not like you could walk in with absolutely no talent whatsoever. But I'm sure there's many, many talented people that have been overlooked by the system because they weren't pretty enough. But then we have to consider how aesthetic value actually carries over. Because ultimately, films and television are visual mediums, which means they require aesthetic consideration. And if it's a business, well, if you're going to make more money by having prettier actors and actresses, then it makes sense that you would hire prettier, higher actresses and actors. Which means when you're designing your system, it's like that phrase of, is TV ugly or not ugly, which, for those unfamiliar, is the relation of, he's not actually unattractive, he's just unattractive by higher standards. And I don't care how potentially rude that sounds, or the whole higher standards thing, that is what it is. People in those positions have a higher standard for beauty, in the same way that, let's say you play a sport at the local level, you might be the best in your squad. At the regional level, you might be one of the best. At the national level, you might be the gold medal winner. At the continental level, you become the gold medal winner. Nationally, that's another step up again. Sorry, internationally, it's another step up again. Which, of course, it doesn't matter if it's entirely skill based, there will always be hierarchies of this, that, and the other. It doesn't matter whether or not you think the system should be designed differently, or if you feel that you've been mistreated by the system. it comes back to something I've discussed before. It's the whole equality of opportunity thing. Equality of opportunity is great in theory, but the higher up a system you go, it's not scalable. Equality of opportunity doesn't scale very well, because then eventually you're getting people who are demanding equal opportunity, not based on skill level. They're demanding equal opportunity because they feel that for it to be a fair playing field, everybody has to be given the same opportunity. But that's just not how that works. If you're hiring scientists for a job, you're not going to hire, like, if let's say, alright, let's say I want to start a company, and my company is going to develop algorithms. Then my people I'm going to hire, one, have to be programmers that have actually done some programming before, and if they're learning coding from scratch, they kind of have to commit to the project very wholeheartedly, don't they? Because to learn coding from scratch and then work for me at my company, they one have to show a lot of talent in other fields that seem relevant to what we're doing. But I'd probably be better served by hiring people that have been coding for decades, or if not decades, have recently are at the top of their fields. And there's plenty of people that are very, very strong coders that haven't been doing it for decades but are at the top of their fields. But in the same way that I can't prioritize hiring somebody that demands equality of opportunity if they don't have their prerequisite skill base. That just isn't business. And you can argue that, oh, it's an oppressive capitalistic society. No, it's not. That's how it needs to work for it to. That's how progress happens. If I only hire people that fulfill a diversity quotient, and I'm trying to be very sensitive when I say this because I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. I don't want to upset anybody. I'm not trying to offend anybody. I'm trying to look at this as rationally as possible, because we've all heard about the memes of diversity hires and stuff like that, and to some extent I agree, because you need to break the barriers of an oppressive regime. However, hiring somebody purely based on that without any skill set whatsoever is counterproductive. Meanwhile, if you have a talent pool of people, let's say, well, I'm really hesitant to get into this, but let's press on and explore the issue, because if we don't discuss it, nothing gets solved. Let's say we have 10 applicants, and 5 of them are Caucasian males with all the necessary prerequisites, and then we've got 3 Asian applicants and 2 black applicants. Then, if they've all got the prerequisite skills, it's more a matter of who's got the most relevant experience, or is the best fit for the company, in the sense of, like, they understand the technology, or they've got passion about it. Like, say my business's algorithm is designed to be an audit log, which tracks all algorithmic behavior, and it basically it tells you everything that Alphabet knows about you, it tells you everything Amazon knows about you, Meta, Apple, Android, Microsoft, as well as websites like Wikipedia or chess.com, or there's, or Reddit or 4chan or whatever it is. If you were able to have an audit log which told you exactly what those companies considered your profile to represent at any one time, then somebody who actually gives a damn about all that really matters to me. So it could be in those contexts, one of the Caucasian males has such a keen interest in privacy that clearly they're a very, very good fit for it, because understanding what information about you is non-verbally leaked and non-verbally communicated is a massive part of understanding how that audit log worked in the first place. At the same time, if it turns out that these algorithms do have a cultural bias and are, being shitty and being racist and, all the other shit that goes along with that, then perhaps having an applicant that's from that demographic will help me better understand the perspective of what's considered racist. So let's say, for example, but then if I specifically hire one Asian, one black, one Caucasian, because okay, let's say there's 3 roles and I deliberately get one of each. At the same time, it could be that the 3 Asian applicants are the most skilled technically and provide all the necessary competence for the role. At the same time, it could be that hiring 2 black applicants, one Caucasian is, but then I'm missing out on the Asian perspective, and then it's a really tricky thing, because then you have to wonder what actually is the best fit for the company, and you have to. There's so many variables. It's reasonably complex. But without having a complex problem to solve, we don't really get to the root of solving the other complex problem. We're just chatting about oversimplified situations, and if we chat about oversimplified stuff all the time, then we don't really get into the nuance of it. That's some of my personal bias coming through now. Is I have a very I get irritated when people prefer to stick with small talk rather than engage in more complicated discussion. I think it's a sad commentary on society that people are terrified to talk about complicated things because they'll feel like an idiot, or they don't understand. It's like, well, if you don't understand, that's fine. I love talking about stuff I don't understand, because how else am I going to understand it? It's the student's mindset. This is the tricky thing about doing the podcast on my own, because with ideas like this, it would help tremendously to have a second input on all of it. But at the same time, one of the reasons I like doing the podcast by myself is I get to explore these ideas without any interruption. And it's not to say that anybody I have on is interrupting. It's more that if I can do all of this, I want to see how far I can go by my own understanding, so that when I have the discussions with other people, I can better contribute and have a wider pool of experience to understand what they're saying. Right. I think that'll do for today. So I want to do a little bit of a summarization before we end broadcast. So non-verbal leakage is a massive component of data mining, and I think more and more people need to be aware of that. I think developing a product such as an algorithmic mirror would be a great way to elucidate the matter to people and help teach them about what their data is actually being used for, because it's not just telling them about stuff they're interested in, it is basically writing a script for them and guiding them along a pathway which might not actually be. It might be in their best interest, it might not be. That's the thing, is it's really hard to tell, because so much of it is based on the idea of somebody else's perspective of what's best for you. And ultimately, what's best for you might not be what makes you happiest, and then it's a tricky balance. Kind of wanted a bombshell to end on. What kind of knowledge bombs have we got so far? What is algorithmic doublespeak? Can an algorithm communicate in doublespeak to us? Can an algorithm implant multiple ideas via one thread of communication? Because if it can, then basically every time you read anything ever, you have to interpret it through multiple levels to understand what's being said, and even then you may not ever truly understand what's going on. And then we just have to accept that we don't know everything. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon. If you enjoyed it, please like, share, subscribe, comment, all that jazz, and we'll see you again soon. Have a nice day. Bye.